In 1990, the James B. Lansing factory in Los Angeles quietly moved on from the speaker that had defined its identity. The JBL L100 Century was not just another wooden box. Introduced in 1970 with its iconic Quadrex foam grille, it had bridged the gap between the recording studio and the American living room. For $273, a listener could own the exact acoustic signature that mixing engineers trusted in Hollywood. It worked. Moving over 125,000 pairs, it became the best-selling loudspeaker of the decade. It dominated stereo showrooms, college dorms, and rock and roll basements across the country. The paradox is that the L100 did not disappear because it stopped sounding good. It faded because the American audio market changed its priorities. But the real story of the JBL L100 is not just the story of a discontinued model, it is the story of how American hi-fi peaked, a brief era when massive wooden cabinets and 12-inch woofers were a cultural centerpiece, before the market traded sheer dynamic impact for the invisible convenience of soundbars and Bluetooth cylinders. Every week, we tell the stories of the American speakers, audio brands, and stereo stores that once shaped how people heard music, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. Inside a Los Angeles recording studio in 1970. The American recording studio in the late 1960s was undergoing a physical and acoustic crisis. In Los Angeles, California, the music was getting louder, the multi-track tape machines were getting wider, and the mixing consoles were expanding across the control rooms. For decades, the standard for American studio sound had been set by Altec Lansing, specifically the massive Altec 604 duplex speakers. They were highly efficient, but they were the size of small refrigerators. As mixing boards grew to accommodate 8 and 16 tracks of audio, engineers found themselves pushed further back from the glass. The large Altec cabinets could no longer be easily mounted above the window or placed near the engineer. The room lacked space. The engineers lacked a speaker that could sit directly on the meter bridge of the console, close to their ears, without sacrificing the sheer dynamic force required to mix a rock and roll record. This was the American absence. The industry desperately needed a compact box that could survive the brutal, sustained volume of a professional session. In 1968, the engineers at James B. Lansing Sound in Los Angeles delivered an answer. They introduced the JBL 4310. It was a studio monitor, a speaker used in recording studios to reveal details clearly during mixing, designed to be small enough to hang from the ceiling or sit on a console, yet rugged enough to handle massive power. JBL engineers worked closely with Capitol Records in Hollywood to refine the prototype. The 4310 was unapologetically ugly. It was a raw utility box, finished in textured gray with controls bolted to the front. But in the control room, it was a revelation. It featured a heavy 12-inch woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums, that could deliver a physical punch directly to the engineer's chest. It projected the mid-range forward, cutting through the dense mix of electric guitars and heavy percussion. Almost overnight, the 4310 became a standard in Southern California studios. Music. But then, JBL executives noticed an anomaly that could not be explained by studio budgets alone. The 4310 was selling in quantities that far exceeded the number of professional recording studios in America. The problem was not a sudden explosion of new studios. The reality was that recording engineers, session musicians, and record producers were buying extra pairs of the gray utility boxes and hauling them home to their living rooms. They wanted the exact sound they heard during the mix when they listened to records on the weekend. This unauthorized crossover revealed a massive blind spot in the American hi-fi market. At the time, the dominant home audio aesthetic was dictated by the East Coast sound. Companies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, like Acoustic Research and KLH, had conquered the living room with acoustic suspension designs. Acoustic suspension, a sealed box design where the air inside the cabinet acts like a spring to control the woofer, produced deep, accurate bass from a small box, but it was notoriously inefficient. East Coast speakers were polite. They were designed for classical music, jazz, and the acoustic dampening of carpeted suburban living rooms. They sounded like a concert hall viewed from the 10th row. But in 1969, American popular music was no longer polite. A generation of listeners wanted the visceral, forward, high-impact sound of a live rock concert. They wanted the West Coast sound. Recognizing that consumers were already buying the ugly studio monitor for home use, JBL made a simple, devastatingly effective calculation. They would take the exact acoustic engineering of the 4310, wrap it in a beautiful oiled walnut veneer, a thin layer of attractive wood used on the outside of a speaker cabinet, and sell it directly to the American public. In the summer of 1970, at the Consumer Electronics Show, JBL unveiled the L100 Century. The American entry was immediate and overwhelming, priced at $273 per speaker. Roughly $2,200 today when adjusted for inflation, it was a premium product, yet perfectly positioned for a middle-class listener willing to invest in serious audio. It was manufactured in JBL's massive facility on Casitas Avenue in Los Angeles, where skilled workers wound heavy voice coils and assembled the heavy magnet structures that gave the speaker its relentless durability. The L100 was technically identical to its studio counterpart in almost every way, but visually, it was a masterpiece of American mid-century consumer design. Instead of a plain cloth cover, JBL equipped the L100 with the Quadrex grille. This was a block of sculptured acoustic foam, cut into a three-dimensional grid of squares, available in burnt orange, ultramarine blue, or chocolate brown. It was impossible to ignore. When a pair of L100 sat in a hi-fi showroom, they did not look like traditional furniture. They looked like modern art. The early reception shattered the polite traditions of stereo retail. When a customer walked into a stereo store in Chicago, Dallas, or Seattle, the dealer demonstration was fundamentally uneven. If the salesman played a rock record through a pair of East Coast acoustic suspension speakers, the sound was warm, accurate, and slightly distant. When the salesman switched the receiver to the JBL L100, the room physically changed. The L100 was highly efficient, meaning it played much louder from a given amount of amplifier power than its sealed box rivals. The mid-range driver, a driver designed to reproduce the middle frequencies, where most voices and instruments live, projected guitars and vocals directly into the center of the room. The bass did not just rumble, it kicked. To a 20-year-old buyer listening to Led Zeppelin or The Doors, the choice was instantaneous. The L100 sounded like the music was happening inside the room. By 1971, the L100 was moving out of stereo stores faster than the Casitas Avenue factory could build them. It became the aspirational standard for a generation. It sat on cinder blocks in college dorm rooms, flanked silver Marantz receivers in suburban basements, and glowed in the corners of shag-carpeted living rooms. It was not just a speaker. It was a cultural broadcast that the listener took their music seriously. The origin of the L100 was rooted in the strict, unforgiving requirements of professional studio accuracy. But its long-term survival would now depend on a much more chaotic, trend-driven arena, the American retail floor. When a listener unboxed a pair of JBL L100 speakers in 1971, the first breakthrough was strictly visual. Traditional American hi-fi speakers were designed to politely disappear into the architecture of a room. They wore muted tweed, linen, or plain brown cloth grills, meant to blend seamlessly with bookshelves, brick fireplaces, and heavy living room curtains. The L100 refused to blend. its sculpted Quadrex foam grille, a deeply textured, three-dimensional grid of squares available in vibrant burnt orange, ultramarine blue, or chocolate brown, looked like a piece of aggressively modern California pop art. It demanded absolute visual attention before the receiver was even turned on. But underneath that foam, the physical engineering was what permanently altered the American audio market. If a curious buyer pulled the foam grille off the heavy, oiled walnut cabinet, they did not find a polite, hidden acoustic system. They found three exposed, highly engineered drivers that looked like they belonged on a laboratory test bench. The massive 12-inch woofer was treated with a thick, white damping compound called Aquaplast, giving it a distinctive, stark appearance against the black baffle. Above it sat a 5-inch mid-range driver and a paper cone tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail. Tying them all together was the internal crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them. In the L100, the crossover was deliberately voiced to push the mid-range and treble aggressively forward. When an American teenager dropped the needle on a pressing of The Who or Jimi Hendrix in their wood-paneled basement, the L100 did not recreate the illusion of sitting in a quiet, carpeted concert hall. It recreated the illusion of standing directly in front of a Marshall amplifier stack. The snare drum snapped with a physical, percussive crack. The bass guitar had a heavy, tactile weight that hit the listener in the chest. The technical secret behind this physical impact was the speaker's extraordinary sensitivity. Sensitivity, how loud a speaker plays from 1 watt of power measured at a set distance, dictated everything about the limits of an American stereo system. East Coast acoustic suspension speakers required massive, heavy, expensive amplifiers just to wake up and move air. The JBL L100 was brutally efficient. It could take a modest, affordable 35-watt Pioneer or Sansui receiver and generate enough acoustic energy to rattle the windows of a suburban house. This high efficiency fundamentally changed the economics of building a home hi-fi system. At $273 per speaker, or $546 for a stereo pair, the L100 was undeniably an expensive luxury. In 1971, a pair of L100s cost nearly a month's gross income for an average American manufacturing worker. They often cost more than the turntables and receivers used to drive them. Yet because they did not require a massively expensive, high-wattage amplifier to play loud, young buyers could justify the high purchase price. They could buy the premium L100s, connect them to a budget-friendly receiver, and still achieve deafening, studio-level volume in their dorm rooms. The L100 was not sold in department stores alongside washing machines and vacuum cleaners. It reached the American public through a rapidly expanding system of dedicated, specialized hi-fi retailers. This distribution breakthrough was driven by the psychological theater of the dealer demonstration. In places like Pacific Stereo on the West Coast and Tech Hi-Fi in New England, salesmen learned quickly that the L100 was the ultimate retail closing tool. A customer would sit in a carpeted, soundproof showroom, listening to a pair of large, sealed sealed box acoustic suspension speakers. The salesman would then turn the master speaker selector dial on the wall panel to the JBLs. Because the L100 was significantly more efficient, it immediately played louder than the competing speakers at the exact same volume knob setting. To the human ear, louder almost always registers as clearer and more dynamic. The L100 simply overpowered its rivals on the showroom floor, dominating the A/B comparison test and securing the sale. Major American audio institutions and listening communities could not ignore the shift. Influential magazines like Stereo Review and High Fidelity analyzed its West Coast sound profile, noting its deliberate, Chosiolef, Tenori, Joeward, punchy, mid-range presence that defied flat frequency measurements. Independent record stores in Chicago and Detroit installed L100s behind their sales counters to fill the aisles with sound. Local FM rock stations mounted them in their broadcast booths. Even musicians who had tracked their albums at Capitol Records in Hollywood or Sound City in the San Fernando Valley bought L100s for their own homes to verify test pressings. The speaker successfully bridged the gap between the professionals making the music and the consumers buying it. What competitors could not easily copy was the L100's American moat, its sheer, relentless mechanical survivability. A beautiful cabinet and an exciting sound profile were useless if the drivers burned out after a week. A major problem in early 1970s audio was that high-volume rock and roll routinely destroyed delicate hi-fi equipment. Tweeters melted under the heat. Woofers tore at the seams. The engineers in Los Angeles had designed the L100's components to endure the brutal abuse of a professional recording session. The voice coil, a coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it, was massively overbuilt using flat wire copper. The magnet structure, the heavy iron and magnet assembly that helps drive the voice coil and cone, was forged to industrial weight standards. When a college student hosted a crowded party in their dorm room and pushed their amplifier deep into heavy distortion, unwanted change added to the sound by the speaker, amplifier, or room, the L100 simply absorbed the electrical punishment and kept playing. It offered the sonic precision of high fidelity combined with the rugged, indestructible nature of a PA system. This combination of striking visual design, acoustic efficiency, showroom dominance, and bulletproof engineering created a cultural juggernaut. It did not matter if an audiophile purist in a magazine argued that the speaker slightly colored the sound. The room did not care about the purist. The L100 gave the American listener exactly what the era demanded. The visceral, electric energy of the studio control room, boxed in oiled walnut and bright foam, delivered directly to the living room couch. The badge on the grill was not decoration. It was a promise about sound. That promise made the L100 the most desired speaker in America. But maintaining that level of dominance would require JBL to feed a retail machine that was growing hungrier, more crowded, and far more dangerous. By 1973, the American audio market had reorganized itself around the heavy, forward momentum of the West Coast sound, and the JBL L100 was its undisputed flagship. The speaker's dominance was not merely a matter of good marketing. It was built on a vast, interlocking American listening ecosystem. Los Angeles built the heavy drivers. Hollywood studios verified the acoustic signature. Stereo chains like Pacific Stereo in California and Tech Hi-Fi in New England built the demonstration rooms. Independent record stores in Chicago and Detroit played them behind the counter to drive album sales. College dorms in Ann Arbor and Austin made them a cultural requirement. American living rooms made the promise real. The scale of production at JBL's Casitas Avenue factory in Los Angeles expanded rapidly to meet the frenzy. In the early 1970s, the facility transformed from a respected maker of professional and high-end niche audio into a massive consumer electronics engine. At its peak, the factory was processing enormous quantities of oiled walnut veneer, heavy cast aluminum driver frames, and thousands of square feet of the signature Quadrex foam. By the end of the decade, JBL would sell an estimated 125,000 pairs of the L100. It was a staggering number for a premium loudspeaker that cost $546 a pair. The L100 became the highest-selling single-speaker model of the era, elevating JBL from a successful audio company to a foundational American speaker empire. This scale was made possible by the golden age of the American stereo store. The L100 did not sit on warehouse shelves waiting for mail-order buyers. it was sold through a highly curated dealer network, a group of local shops and sales channels that demonstrated, sold, and supported a speaker brand. In these carpeted, acoustically treated showrooms, the L100 was a physical event. When a customer walked past rows of polite, cloth-covered acoustic suspension boxes from New England, the brightly colored foam grills of the L100 immediately signaled a different philosophy. The timing perfectly aligned with a major American cultural moment. The early 1970s saw the explosion of the solid-state stereo receiver. Devices from companies like Marantz, Pioneer, and Kenwood that offered glowing silver faceplates, precise tuning dials, and reliable power. Millions of American teenagers and young adults were investing unprecedented amounts of disposable income into home hi-fi systems. They were buying dense, multi-layered rock albums pressed on heavy vinyl. In a cramped American college dorm room, where cheap department store phonographs usually reduced a rock band to a thin, tinny scratch, the right speaker could make the bass player appear at the foot of the bed, close enough for the listener to believe the walls had disappeared. This was the specific magic of the L100. It excelled at projecting a massive soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. Because the speaker was originally voiced for studio engineers who needed to hear direct sound that travels straight from the speaker to the listener without bouncing off walls. The L100 aggressively pushed the music forward. It did not rely on reflected sound that bounces off walls, floors, or ceilings before reaching the listener to create a sense of space. It simply punched the air with relentless authority. The L100 was also remarkably forgiving of the equipment driving it. Its impedance, the electrical load a speaker presents to an amplifier, was a stable 8 ohms, meaning it did not stress or overheat the affordable receivers that young buyers were taking home. While purists argued that its frequency response, how evenly a speaker reproduces low, middle, and high sounds, was deliberately spiked in the mid-bass and upper mid-range to sound exciting rather than perfectly flat, the American buying public did not care about anechoic chamber measurements. They cared about how the kick drum felt in a wood-paneled basement. This direct physical presentation made the L100 the ultimate status symbol of the American youth culture. It was heavily featured in the cultural consciousness of the era, eventually paving the way for iconic moments like Maxell's Blown Away advertisement. While the specific speaker in that famous photo was slightly different, the visual language of the era was universally understood. A large, high-efficiency American speaker was not background music. It was a physical force. Yet the very forces that drove the L100 to unprecedented scale were beginning to shift the ground underneath the Los Angeles factory. The speaker had conquered the American living room. It had also taught the company to depend on a massive, expensive retail system that was about to undergo a brutal transformation. The sheer scale of the L100's success forced JBL to redesign its entire corporate footprint. By 1977, the company had outgrown its original Los Angeles buildings and relocated to a sprawling, state-of-the-art manufacturing campus in Northridge, California. The San Fernando Valley effectively became the industrial capital of the West Coast Sound. Inside this massive facility, hundreds of American workers manned specialized assembly lines. They wound copper wire for heavy voice coils, stamped rigid aluminum frames for the massive 12-inch woofers, and applied the oiled walnut veneer to thousands of heavy wooden cabinets. At its absolute peak in the late 1970s, the L100 helped JBL dominate the premium domestic loudspeaker market. The brand established a fortress of distribution, relying on a fiercely loyal dealer network spanning hundreds of independent stereo stores, from Tech Hi-Fi in the Northeast to Sound Advice in Florida to Pacific Stereo on the West Coast. These showrooms were cathedrals of sound. They featured carpeted walls, dimmed lighting, and long rows of heavy speakers wired to massive master switching boards. In this environment, the L100 was invincible. When a salesman switched a demonstration from a polite acoustic suspension speaker to the highly efficient L100, the sudden jump in volume, the aggressive mid-range punch, and the physical thump of the kick drum closed the sale almost instantly. In the American living room, the stereo system was not a secondary appliance. It was the architectural and cultural center of the house. A serious American hi-fi system of this era typically featured a heavy, brushed aluminum stereo receiver glowing with warm analog tuning dials, a precision turntable spinning pristine vinyl records, and a pair of JBL L100s flanking the furniture. The bright orange, blue, or brown Quadrex foam grills demanded attention. They signaled to anyone entering the room that the owner cared deeply about high fidelity. Listeners would spend hours sitting in the exact geometric center between the two heavy cabinets, experiencing a massive soundstage and a phantom center image where the vocalist seemed to stand right in the middle of the room. The L100 handled the heavy rock of Led Zeppelin, the complex studio engineering of Fleetwood Mac, and the driving bass of early disco with equal, relentless authority. For a brief window in American consumer history, there was absolute alignment between what the engineers wanted to build, what the hi-fi magazines wanted to review, what the stereo stores wanted to sell, and what the public wanted to buy. The L100 was the ultimate expression of the component audio dream, the belief that massive, beautifully engineered wooden boxes were a permanent necessity in the American home. But this dominant ecosystem was entirely dependent on a set of economic and cultural conditions that were highly fragile. The L100 required a listener willing to sacrifice massive amounts of floor space for two heavy wooden cabinets. It required an independent dealer network with the profit margins to support soundproof demonstration rooms and knowledgeable salesmen. It required a domestic manufacturing supply chain where California labor, premium wood veneer, and heavy magnet structures remained affordable enough to price the speaker within reach of the middle class. By the turn of the decade, those foundational pillars were quietly beginning to fracture. The iconic acoustic foam of the Quadrex grill was chemically unstable, slowly beginning to dry, crumble, and turn to dust under ultraviolet light. And far beyond the Northridge factory, the American retail landscape was preparing for a seismic shift that would punish any company building expensive heavy wooden boxes. The speaker had conquered the room. The market outside the room was about to rewrite the rules of survival. The long decline of the JBL L100 did not begin with a catastrophic factory closure, a sudden drop in sales, or a dramatic corporate bankruptcy. The first small crack appeared quietly, directly on the front of the cabinet, right inside the American living room. By the late 1970s, the famous Quadrex foam grills, the vibrant orange, blue, and brown sculpted material that defined the speaker's visual identity, began to chemically break down. Exposed to daily ultraviolet light streaming through suburban windows, the foam slowly dried, crumbled, and turned into a sticky, disintegrating dust. Listeners were forced to peel the rotting material away, leaving the heavy 12-inch woofers and paper tweeters entirely exposed to the room. It was a cosmetic failure, but it acted as a physical warning. The massive wooden boxes that anchored the stereo rack were not immortal. While owners swept up the crumbled foam from their carpets, a much deeper structural fracture was spreading across the American audio market. JBL was about to be hit by a relentless combination of retail pressure and a fundamental listening culture shift. The L100 had been engineered for a highly specific environment: the independent American stereo store. These specialized hi-fi shops relied on high profit margins, acoustically treated demonstration rooms, and salesmen who could take the time to run an A/B listening comparison. But as the 1980s approached, the distribution of consumer electronics began to change. The market shifted heavily toward mall retailers and the early predecessors of big box warehouse stores. In a sprawling, brightly lit warehouse environment, the intimate dealer demonstration disappeared. Customers no longer sat in a plush chair while a salesman switched inputs on a masterboard. They pushed a metal shopping cart down a linoleum aisle, comparing the L100's premium price tag to towering stacks of bundled rack systems, all-in-one stereo packages wrapped in cheap plastic that promised an entire wall of electronics for the cost of 2 Los Angeles-built cabinets. Retailers demanded lower wholesale prices and higher volume. A premium American speaker that required heavy shipping costs, expensive walnut veneer, and domestically manufactured cast aluminum drivers struggled to maintain its profit margins in a room where the lowest price tag dictated the sale. At the exact same time, the fundamental sound of American music was changing, and the acoustic profile of the L100 was suddenly caught out of time. The speaker had been originally voiced in the Los Angeles studios to cut through the dense, warm, analog tape compression of 1970s rock records. Its aggressive crossover network sent an intense, unbridled electrical signal to the mid-range driver and tweeter, giving vinyl records a live, present, and physical energy. But in 1982, the compact disc arrived in the United States. The CD introduced a massive shift in digital dynamic range and high-frequency clarity. When an American listener brought home a brand new silver CD player, wired it into their receiver, and played a digitally recorded album through a pair of L100s, the room reacted differently. The forward upper mid-range that had made rock guitars sound incredibly tactile on vinyl suddenly made digital synthesizers and early digital drum tracks sound harsh, glaring, and fatiguing. The technical reality was that the L100's paper cone tweeter and deliberate crossover bump were not designed for the icy precision of digital audio. The digital glare bounced off the hard surfaces of American apartments, making the once-beloved West Coast punch feel exhausting after an hour of listening. In basements from Chicago to Seattle, listeners found themselves constantly turning down the treble knobs on their receivers. The speaker that had perfectly captured the analog era was physically fighting the digital era. The parent company recognized the shift, but massive corporate structures do not turn quickly. JBL was part of Harman International, and under corporate consolidation, the brand was tasked with expanding its reach into broader, more profitable consumer categories. The engineers introduced updated iterations, the L100A, the L112, and eventually the L96, attempting to flatten the frequency response, tame the harshness, and adapt to modern digital tastes. Some of these later models were technically superior, featuring advanced dome tweeters and refined crossover networks. But the American listening public is rarely driven by technical improvements alone. The original L100 had captured a specific cultural lightning strike. The revised models, while mathematically more accurate, watts lacked the rebellious, visceral identity of the original. Furthermore, the competition had learned how to emulate the West Coast sound for half the price. Importers and rival domestic brands realized they did not need to build a heavy, indestructible cast aluminum woofer to sell a speaker. They only needed a cabinet that sounded loud and punchy in a retail showroom for 5 minutes. Cheaper boxes made of thin particle board wrapped in fake vinyl wood grain began to flood the market. To a casual buyer walking through a mall electronics store, the cheaper clone looked similar enough to a JBL, but it left enough money in the budget to buy a new television. The L100 was suddenly surrounded by a market that praised fidelity, but rewarded aggressive price cutting. The heavy cast aluminum woofer still moved air with authority. The cabinet still felt like solid furniture. But the retail ecosystem that had allowed it to thrive was rapidly closing its doors, leaving the massive Los Angeles factory exposed to a future it had not been built to survive. By the late 1980s, another massive structural force hit the Los Angeles factory: the architectural reorganization of the American living room. For 2 decades, the heavy stereo rack had been the undisputed focal point of domestic entertainment. But as the 1990s approached, the television screen permanently replaced the silver stereo receiver as the center of gravity in the American home. The era of the wide baffle, heavy wooden stereo speaker was ending. The era of the American home theater was beginning. This technological and listening culture shift fundamentally changed what a buyer expected a speaker cabinet to do. Families renting movies on VHS or buying early DVDs did not want 2 massive, brightly colored boxes dominating their floor space. They wanted a surround sound experience. They wanted tall, slender tower speakers that could sit flush against a television console without drawing visual attention. They wanted a dedicated center channel strictly for dialogue. And they wanted a separate subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies, hidden out of sight in the corner of the room. The JBL L100 was too wide, too heavy, and entirely the wrong shape for the home theater era. It was designed to be looked at, to be the physical centerpiece of a room. The new market wanted speakers that were designed to physically disappear. This shift in consumer taste was violently accelerated by the collapse of the independent hi-fi dealer. Big box retailers like Circuit City and Best Buy demanded audio products that fit this new, streamlined visual aesthetic. They did not want to stock expensive, heavy-oiled walnut cabinets that required specialized shipping and careful unboxing. They wanted black plastic, slim profiles, and bundled convenience. The premium, soundproofed stereo stores that had originally championed the L100 were rapidly going out of business, unable to compete with the warehouse pricing and massive marketing budgets of the national chains. JBL faced a brutal corporate reality. To survive the 1990s retail landscape, the parent company, Harman International, had to aggressively adapt the brand for mass market volume. This survival strategy led directly to corporate consolidation and severe brand dilution. The famous badge, which had once been a guarantee of professional, studio-grade American engineering, began to appear on radically different products. It appeared on affordable car audio speakers sold in plastic blister packs at local auto parts stores. It appeared on small, cheap multimedia computer speakers sitting on college dorm room desks. It appeared on lightweight home theater-in-a-box systems sold in massive pallets at big box stores. The brand successfully chased the American consumer, but it sacrificed the premium, untouchable aura that the L100 had built. The logo survived on the shelf. The deep listening culture behind it was dismantled. Behind the scenes, the economics of domestic manufacturing were becoming impossible to sustain. The massive Northridge campus in California had been built to scale the heavy, labor-intensive production of the West Coast sound. But American speakers required expensive domestic wood, heavy cast aluminum drivers, massive magnet structures, physical testing, and highly skilled local labor. As wood, labor, and shipping became increasingly expensive, it became mathematically unfeasible to build a heavy wooden speaker in California and sell it at a price that could compete with imported electronics. The company quietly began offshoring its consumer speaker production. The raw, industrial pride of building indestructible woofers in Los Angeles was replaced by the cold efficiency of global supply chains. The cheaper imported speakers did not need to recreate a perfect stereo image. They only needed to sound good enough for a casual listener watching an action movie or playing a video game. The L100 line was quietly retired, replaced by a confusing, ever-changing alphanumeric soup of modern product lines that lacked any distinct visual identity. The American hi-fi buyer who wanted a serious, dedicated stereo pair was now considered a niche audiophile. no longer the driving economic force of the consumer electronics market. By the 2000s, the concept of the living room stereo system itself was under direct attack. The market shifted away from component audio entirely. First came the soundbar, a long, narrow speaker system designed to sit near a television and replace multiple home theater speakers. It offered terrible stereo separation compared to a pair of L100s, but it required zero floor space and only one cable. Then came the Bluetooth speaker, a portable speaker that receives sound wirelessly from a phone, tablet, or computer. The new generation of American listeners did not sit in a chair between two heavy cabinets to listen to a vinyl record. They carried a plastic cylinder in their backpack. They streamed compressed digital audio. They valued convenience, portability, and battery life over sheer acoustic output. The Northridge factory could not reverse the tide. The market had decided that the massive wooden speaker was a dinosaur. The heavy magnets were too expensive. The oiled walnut was unnecessary. The independent dealer network was dead. The original American promise of the L100, that a listener could own the exact acoustic equipment used to mix their favorite records, was simply no longer relevant to how the country consumed sound. The retail shelf changed. The California factory slowed. The heavy woofers stopped. The wood cabinets vanished. The foam grills crumbled. The stereo stores closed. The television took over. The soundbar replaced it all. The room went completely wireless. The JBL brand did not die when the American stereo store collapsed. Instead, it was completely absorbed into the massive global architecture of Harman International and eventually purchased by Samsung. To survive the modern consumer electronics market, the parent company had to adapt the famous badge for maximum retail volume. For years, the logo that once defined professional studio accuracy was primarily stamped onto small, waterproof Bluetooth speakers, cheap wireless earbuds, and plastic computer speakers. The brand survived, but the heavy, uncompromising West Coast sound was largely relegated to the history books. But the ghost of the L100 refused to quietly disappear. By 2018, recognizing a massive, highly profitable surge in vintage audio nostalgia, the parent company made a surprising decision. They resurrected the specific model that had built their empire, releasing the JBL L100 Classic. Visually, it was a masterpiece of corporate memory. It featured the exact same oiled walnut aesthetic, the heavy black baffle, and the iconic, brightly colored Quadrex foam grille. But the American economic reality underneath the speaker had fundamentally changed. The original L100 was an aspirational but attainable product for an average American factory worker, musician, or college student. The modern L100 Classic was a completely re-engineered luxury item, manufactured offshore and priced at over $4,000 a pair. It was no longer a mainstream consumer product. It had become an elite status symbol, targeted directly at wealthy audiophiles trying to buy back the listening rooms of their youth. Long before this corporate revival, however, the original 1970s cabinets were being kept alive by a fierce, underground American preservation community. When the big box stores pushed the massive wooden speakers out of the living room, thousands of L100s ended up neglected in damp basements, dusty suburban garages, and neighborhood estate sales. Today, they are aggressively hunted. Vintage audio collectors scour Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, Audio Gone, and local thrift stores looking for the distinctive heavy cabinets. A massive secondary industry of specialized repair technicians and restoration experts has emerged across the United States to service these specific boxes. Small independent businesses offer dedicated speaker refoaming shops and professional crossover recap services, meticulously replacing dried-out old capacitors in the crossover to restore the speaker's original electrical performance. Enthusiasts spend weeks carefully scraping away the sticky, rotted remnants of the original orange foam, repainting the faded black baffles and applying fresh white aquaplast damping compound to the old woofers. These collectors do not spend hundreds of dollars and countless hours on restoration merely for a vintage aesthetic. The original L100 still matters for a strictly functional physical reason. A restored heavy wooden cabinet with a fully functioning 12-inch cast aluminum woofer and a stabilized crossover network still moves air in a way that modern acoustic engineering fundamentally cannot fake. A modern, compact wireless speaker relies heavily on digital signal processing to artificially trick the human ear into perceiving bass that is not physically there. The L100 relies on pure physical displacement. When the kick drum hits on a heavy analog recording, the massive paper cone physically strikes the air in the room, creating a tactile wave of pressure that hits the listener directly in the chest. It is not a digital algorithm. It is brute force mechanics. The physical American landscape where that mechanical dominance was born, however, has been almost entirely erased. The massive Casitas Avenue facility in Los Angeles, where the first L100s were designed and assembled by hand, was swallowed by modern urban commercial redevelopment. The sprawling Northridge manufacturing campus in the San Fernando Valley, once the undisputed, roaring epicenter of the West Coast sound, was eventually shuttered, demolished, and paved over. Today, the site that once employed hundreds of American workers winding copper voice coils and cutting premium walnut veneer is a massive generic retail shopping center and a sprawling residential apartment complex. The heavy industrial machinery is gone. The soundproof testing rooms are gone. Yet a strange footnote remains in the American recording industry. Even today, in some high-end studios in Los Angeles and Nashville, equipped with modern, surgically precise digital monitors that cost tens of thousands of dollars, a battered pair of original L100s will sometimes sit quietly in the corner of the control room. Producers do not use them to analyze the microscopic details of a pristine digital mix. They keep them wired to the console for one specific purpose: to remember exactly how a rock record is supposed to feel when it is played dangerously loud. The story of the JBL L100 is ultimately the story of a compromise the American audio market decided to make. The country once believed that high fidelity required physical sacrifice. Listeners were willing to sacrifice valuable floor space, stretch their budgets, and dedicate an entire room to an honest, physical acoustic experience. The heavy oiled walnut cabinet was considered a permanent piece of household furniture, designed to be repaired, cherished, and inherited. But the market eventually decided that convenience was far more valuable than physical impact. The American living room traded the massive mass repairable dedicated stereo system for the invisible convenience of the soundbar and the disposable battery-powered Bluetooth cylinder. We gained the unprecedented ability to carry our music in our pockets and stream it instantly anywhere. But we lost the physical weight of the music in the room. Still, the original boxes refused to die. Somewhere in an American basement, a heavy walnut cabinet sits on a short wooden stand, the restored orange foam grille catching the dim light of a silver receiver, its massive woofer waiting for the drop of a needle to push the air and change the shape of the room one more time. See you in the next one.